So, I've got a little poem I'm going to read you this morning. And it's from a book by Lynn Estrada. And she said, I like to receive hugs, especially when I'm feeling blue. Showing compassion is nice and something we can do. But there are times when a hug or a touch is not something I want or need. And it's not cool to force me to hug back unless I've agreed. My body is mine, and I have a choice who I let near. So if I don't feel comfortable, then I just say no, to be clear. Now, have anybody talked to you? Has anybody talked to you about consent? About saying yes or no, or if you don't want somebody to hug you, what you do? Kind of, a little bit. So if somebody wants to give you a hug and you don't want to do that, you want to hug back, what do you do instead? Say, no thank you? You can say, how about a fist bump? How about a fist bump? Okay, you can do that. Or how about a high five? Okay, low five. Yeah, high five, low five. Okay. Or elbows. Do you remember during COVID, instead of shaking hands, people would bump their elbows instead? Because that was safer, right? Or you can do what we do here at the end of the service. You're not here because you're in your classes. But at the end of the service, everybody holds hands. You've done that, but you know, some people don't want to do that. So you know what they do instead? They cross their hands in front of them. Touch toes? That's a good idea too. I like that. Let's touch toes. Let's touch toes. There you go. Oh, you had to reach so far. Okay. So, but I think you need to remember always that your body is yours and that you give consent. And if something makes you feel uncomfortable, or if somebody makes you feel uncomfortable, what do? You talk to a trusted adult. You know, do you know who those are in your life? You should know. They could be your teachers, they could be your pastor, they could be your parents, you could be an uncle or an aunt or a grandparent. Sometimes the neighbor is a trusted adult. You need to know who those are in your life. I have a trusted adult. I have one too. Do you have one, Liz? Liz has one too. So it's a good thing to remember, okay? Will you join me in a moment of prayer and reflection? Spirit of life and love, we find ourselves at a time in this country when our rights are being eliminated or chipped away at. Voting rights, immigration rights, healthcare rights, and reproductive rights, just to name a few. It's difficult on some days to remain hopeful. Help us to find that steady place in our lives so that we can stand together and fight to regain what we have lost. Please join me in a moment of meditation.
I know what it's like to desperately want a baby, and I know what it's like to desperately not want one. Those two experiences came at very different times in my life. When I was in high school, I had a serious boyfriend whom I loved, but I was also a young woman with plans for my future, and becoming a teen mom was not one of them. Without telling my mother, I went to Planned Parenthood where I was prescribed the birth control pill. It was the mid-1980s. I didn't need parental consent. The doctor didn't question my decision. The visit was confidential, respectful, and straightforward. Years later, after struggling with infertility and experiencing 2 miscarriages, I remember thinking how ironic it was that I had spent so much of my life trying not to become pregnant, only to discover that when I was finally ready to be a mom, it wasn't so easy. Both miscarriages were discovered after learning there was no longer a heartbeat. In each case, I chose to have a D&C procedure rather than endure the physical and emotional pain of delivering a pregnancy that could not survive. I still remember the kindness of the nurses as they cared for me while I waited for the procedure. Through each of these experiences, I had something I now realize was an extraordinary gift: bodily autonomy. I was able to make decisions for myself about what would happen. Neither the government, nor my parents, nor doctors could deny this to me. And although I've always voted for candidates who supported reproductive rights and believe deeply that women should have the right to choose, I never truly imagined those rights could disappear. Early motherhood was hard for me. When my kids were babies, they needed so much attention, and it was exhausting. When my children were 6 and 8 years old, I was finally really enjoying being a mom. I loved playing with them. They were sleeping through the night and were in school. They could entertain themselves and didn't need me, my constant care. One night during that time, I dreamt I was pregnant. Despite my previous experience with infertility, this dream was actually a nightmare for me. I couldn't imagine having an infant again. In the dream, I remember thinking about terminating that pregnancy. I woke up relieved to discover it hadn't been real, but if it had been, I would have had the right to make that decision. Today, my children are in their 20s, building their own lives. Neither is ready to become a parent. Yet they are living in a country where the constitutional right to bodily autonomy that I relied upon throughout my childbearing years no longer exists. Depending on where they live, choices that I was able to make privately, safely, and with my doctor's support may no longer be available to them. Looking back, I realize every chapter of my reproductive life required something different: the freedom to prevent a pregnancy, the freedom to grieve a wanted one, and the freedom to imagine making a different choice if my life had taken another turn. I spent much of my life assuming those rights would always be there. It never occurred to me that they could disappear. It's a reminder to me not to take any of our rights for granted. Thank you.
For 18 years, Margaret Sanger and I were very close friends. Yes, she'd been dead for almost 20 years when I started portraying her in the 1980s, but she felt as alive and relevant to me then as she does now. So how did I come to travel with this one-woman show across the country, and what drew me to her story? I've been performing since I was 3 years old. My parents enrolled me in ballet school. It captured me right away, and I've spent 50 years performing in some capacity or another, moving from dance to music to commercial voiceovers to theater. After college, I was part of a theater company in the western suburbs of Chicago. One of our members had written and performed 7 different one-woman shows over a 10-year period in an effort to raise awareness of the importance of passing the Equal Rights Amendment. But now she was having trouble with her health and wasn't able to continue to travel and perform. So she chose 7 members of the company to carry on this legacy that she established. What was remarkable is that all 7 of us women read all of these scripts. and we all chose a different one. Margaret's story stood out for me, and I wanted to bring her to life. When I began, I performed the script as I had been given it. But I was curious, so I started reading more about her life. First, her autobiography from 1938, and then the two biographies published in 1979 and 1992. All of these, while covering the same facts, took different approaches writing them from the climate of the time they were written. Margaret was born in 1879 to a poor family in upstate New York. She was one of 11 surviving children, although her mother had 25 pregnancies in total. Although she stated later that every baby in her family was wanted and loved, as a young woman working as a visiting nurse in New York City, she was shocked to learn that this was not true in most of the cases she saw in the poorer neighborhoods. Another baby put strain on finances and relationships in these poor neighborhoods. It was nursing women after self-induced abortions that gave her her resolve that something had to be done. At that time, condoms were available, but only to men. Women did not have access to them at all. These were provided to contain syphilis. Avoiding pregnancy wasn't even considered. Although illegal, neighborhood abortionists were available to women along with a variety of herbal and physical remedies. For instance, throwing yourself down a flight of stairs to induce an abortion. Knitting needles were often used. In fact, the woman that turned her into an activist was a patient she had nursed back to health after a self-induced abortion. When she was called back to the same house a few months later and the woman bled to death, she was done. She stated that keeping people alive was no longer enough. Then she started her crusade, opening a makeshift office in the city where she dispensed birth control information, what little she had. She wrote articles in the newspaper, The Call, to recommend that women take the responsibility for their health themselves. Well, she may have also recommended overthrowing the government at one point, but that's a small matter. Charged with the violation of the Comstock Act. By the way, has anybody heard of the Comstock Act? Arizona overturned abortion rights last year, citing the law as precedent, a law from 1873. And it may be used, again, to curtail mailing Plan B abortion pills. Well, back to Margaret. At this point, she knew she was in trouble, and so with a forged passport, she fled to England by way of Canada to avoid prison. There she met Havelock Ellis, an English physician and social reformer who studied human sexuality. He taught her everything he knew about birth control, then sent her off to the Netherlands, where the laws and their attitudes about sexual autonomy were quite different than they were here in the United States. They had the most advanced technology, including an early form of the diaphragm. She was so excited by all she'd learned, and she waited till things calmed down before going back home, and she sailed back to New York. Now, she eventually did spend time in prison for her violation of the Comstock Act and for sending lewd information through the mails, because describing birth control methods was considered lewd. But once out of prison, she resumed her work lecturing, founding and setting up Planned Parenthood affiliates throughout the country. At one lecture in Boston, the police chief stated that, quote, "If Margaret Sanger speaks tonight, she will be arrested," unquote. So she went to the lecture, put a large piece of tape over her mouth, and handed her speech to an associate to speak. She worked the rest of her life lobbying government to change laws to ensure women's reproductive health. She died in 1966, 1 year before Connecticut was the last state to legalize birth control. As a rather new feminist in my 20s, I enjoyed portraying her leaning into the issue that Margaret always felt was at the heart of all her work: women's agency over their own bodies. I toured the country performing for nurse practitioner conventions, Girl Scout troops, universities, UU churches, and Planned Parenthood affiliates. Most times I was invited in early and was able to meet with several of the people who worked on the front lines, from Anchorage, Alaska to Tampa, Florida. They told me stories of the women they treated and how they navigated between healthcare, the law, and local attitudes in the culture. The Latina nurse who treated pregnant Mexican women in Salinas was talking with her patient. The patient asked her how many siblings she had growing up, and the nurse said 2. The patient asked her if there was something wrong with her father, and the nurse said no, he wanted a good life for them, and he knew he couldn't provide that if there was more than 3 children. The patient took that in for a moment and said, "Oh, no wonder we're so poor." I was performing at Boise State University, and the professor that booked me told me that a young girl in town had been murdered recently. She'd become pregnant through sexual abuse by her father. So she took the bus to Washington State, where she could receive an abortion without parental permission. And when she returned home, he killed her. When I was at a nurse practitioner convention in Atlanta, I met a doctor who ran a family planning clinic in South Carolina. I asked him how he managed to stay open, and he said, "Oh, they threatened to firebomb my clinic, and I told him to go ahead. I would just move my operation into the downtown hotel. You know, they're all against abortion until it affects their wife, their daughter, or their companion. Then they want to come in the back door after dark, and they don't want any record of being there. I told them that if I had to set up shop somewhere else, I'll never name them, but start writing articles for the town newspaper and describe them so well that everyone will know they've been there. You know what? They leave me alone." I was always so impressed with the dedication and the creativity of the folks who work in the field of reproductive rights and their tireless service to women to make sure that they receive the best care and the most up-to-date information. I heard these stories and many others 30 to 40 years ago and thought that by now, surely, we would have moved past all that. But I can still see all these stories happening in this new century. But now we have women bleeding out in hospital parking lots because doctors are afraid to treat them. I was angry and saddened when Roe v. Wade was overturned, but that didn't change the culture and the rise of Christian nationalism, and the courts have ruled in their favor. It will take a new Congress and president to codify reproductive rights for our country again. So as religious people of faith, what can we do? What avenues are open to us that could make a real difference? Costco has Plan B pills available that you could buy at low cost to have available if the Comstock law is used to prevent shipping them from manufacturers. And you don't need to have a membership to get them. Advocacy work is our most needed, even in these tumultuous times when there is so much to do and finite energy on our parts. UU ministers in red states have asked to establish partner churches in abortion-available states who would take in women from states where abortion is illegal. These networks could be set up quietly between those in both congregations who would be willing to be a lifeline for these women. Some of these tasks are easy and cost little money, and some are riskier. depending on what happens in our country in the next few years. If it feels as if there's an attack on women and their place in society, from reproductive rights to voting rights, let me assure you, there is. We are people of faith, and in our theological principles and purposes, we can lean into the inherent worth and dignity of all persons and the belief in the democratic process. Women should not be dying because of lack of basic health care and the belief that all babies need to be born, no matter how damaging that may be to the mother or the child itself. But where is the work to make sure that these babies are loved, cherished, and provided for after they're born? Margaret said that she lived long enough to see laws change and science advance, but she always felt that the biggest obstacle to women was the attitude in our culture that once a woman becomes master of her own body, she becomes impure. How insulting. I fear that in this political climate, women and their needs will always be down the line to the other priorities, and there is something of belief of ownership over women's bodies. This is an alarming step backwards in our culture, and I fear that many more women will die because some men in our political landscape will have decided that reproductive health is not important. Some women do. Let's prove them wrong. I leave you today with Margaret's own words. Leave the world a better place because you, my child, have dwelt in it. And I know you, all of you here. Many of you have devoted your life to making this a better world for generations to come. The work is in front of us. What will you do in the next few years to make it a reality? To the glory of life.